I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Stephen Burt, who, of course, needs no introduction at all. He's a very well-known historian and a past president of the Society. Stephen's going to talk to us tonight about the Oates family of Leeds between 1700 and 1917. His talk is entitled Merchants, Lawyers and Explorers. And without further ado, well, actually, just before I hand over to Steve, just a reminder that you can ask questions in chat, which we'll deal with at the end of the lecture. So without further ado, I am happy to hand over to Steve.
Good evening, all. I had to give the title of this talk almost a year ago, and at that time I had enough material for a 1-hour lecture. Since then, I have accumulated so much information on the Oates family that this is now 2 separate lectures. The Oates family has left its mark on Leeds. Step out of Leeds Station onto City Square and look east towards Mill Hill and admire one of the most beautiful Unitarians chapels in the country. The rebuilding took place between 1847 to 8 and was spearheaded by Edward Oates of Meanwoodside, who acted as treasurer of the project and insisted on the Manchester-based Bowman and Crowther being appointed as architects because they shared his religious beliefs. Walk down Boar Lane and turn right onto Briggate. And just before the railway viaduct stands the most complete early Georgian merchant's house in the city, and the yard behind, a range of workshops now known as Queen's Court. It was originally called George Court, after George Oates, and, as we shall see shortly, this was the base for his phenomenally successful business. Travel to Chapel Allerton and look at the graceful architecture of the Georgian wing of Allerton Hall, built by Josiah Oates. Or go across to where the judges' lodgings are now, Carr Manor, and look on the roadside there, where you will admire the Revolution Well, built in 1788 by Joseph Oates. Those who travel daily along Meanwood Road, instead of facing the traffic mayhem of Headingley, should bless Joseph Henry Oates and his role in the creation of that turnpike road. Arguably, the greatest legacy of the Oates family in the city today is Meanwood Park, one of the most loved public spaces in the city, where Edward Oates landscaped the grounds and created an American garden. So, who were these people? Tonight's lecture tells the story of the first 3 generations of Leeds-born Oates, and here I have a simplified family tree. The evidence is regrettably limited for the female side of the family in the 18th century. It's definitely a case of his story. But this is addressed in next year's lecture, where Susan and Caroline Oates play pivotal roles, and they truly are ladies to be reckoned with. Now we start at the top with Joseph Oates, and then down to his 4 sons. What's remarkable is he arrived in Leeds on the 8th of June 1700, a 24-year-old man from Chickenley near Dewsbury, a dealer in dye substances for the cloth industry. He was feeling very pleased with himself that day as he stepped out of the moot hall on Briggate. He had just become a freeman of the town of Leeds. This decision of the Court of the Corporation had just been recorded for posterity in a small book measuring a mere 13 inches by 8.5 inches. But the important thing was he was now free to trade in the town. 80 years later, those sons, George, Josiah, and Samuel, would be the richest merchants in Leeds, some of the most successful in the county, enjoying what today we would refer to as a millionaire's lifestyle. How was that incredible transformation in fortune achieved? Well, let's go back to the family tree and look in detail at it. Joseph was the second son of Josiah Oates, gentleman of Chickenley Hall near Dewsbury. Joseph needed to make his fortune away from the limitations of his family estate. His father, a nonconformist, had already started trading in dye substances and had strong connections with Leeds. His first wife had been Elizabeth, daughter of William Fenton of Woodhouse Hill, Hunslet, and his second wife was Hannah, daughter of Thomas Fenton of Hunslet. Members of the wealthy Fenton family had made their money from farming, cloth manufacture, and mining, and they too were nonconformists. It is hardly surprising then that Joseph would also marry a Fenton, and on the 10th of February 1702, he married Mary, the third daughter of Thomas Fenton of Hunslet at Armley Chapel. His new wife was granddaughter of James Ibbotson, one of the wealthiest cloth merchants of the period. And Mary went on to bear Joseph 11 children. But let's place the Oates family in context. The timing of his arrival in Leeds was perfect. November 1700 saw the opening of an enterprise of incredible importance to the commercial success of Leeds, the air and Calder navigation. The scheme involved the deepening or bypassing of the unnavigable sections of the rivers Aire and Calder to permit goods to be carried in large boats directly from the port of Leeds, which we can see here to the left. Peter Brere's wonderful reconstruction as to what it would have looked like, all the way downriver to Hull. Cheap, reliable transport links were critical if the inland town of Leeds was to benefit from international trade. During the 18th century, the West Riding's output of woolen cloth grew eightfold, while its share of national output of woolen cloth rose from under 20% to around 60%. Leeds was at the very heart of an industry experiencing a phenomenal growth. By the 1770s, Leeds merchants handled approximately 1/3 of all the woolen cloth exported from England. This was a vital service to the nation, since woolen cloth accounted for over half England's home-produced exports. In a good year in the 1770s, exports of cloth from Leeds amounted to £1.5 million. That will be well over £1 billion today. Now, the Oates family that we saw earlier played a critical role in that expansion. By 1782, were the largest exporters of cloth in the town, even outselling the giants of the trade, Denison, Dixon, and Leeds. So what was Leeds like when Joseph lived there? Fosson's plan of 1726 shows a compacted, vibrant town with fine, modern merchants' houses peppered along the main streets of Kirkgate, Frigate, and Boar Lane. As the cloth industry grew, so did the town, and with its population rose from 6,000 in 1700 to 17,000 by 1770. I've put an arrow on here in red because it's the coat of arms of James Ibbotson. As we saw a minute ago, Joseph had married his granddaughter. How much better could it be for a network within the town? Superbly placed. And when you look at James Ibbotson, the coat of arms to the left is Lord Irwin's coat of arms of Temple Newsham House, the aristocrat of the area. By 1718, thanks to the early investment and legacy of his mother-in-law, Mary Fenton, sister of James Ibbotson, Joseph Oates had managed to lease business premises in Lower Brigate in a prime site next to the cloth market, where he was ideally placed to secure passing trade. The property consisted of a house, a good shop and warehouse, both fronting the street. He was initially involved in providing dyes to clothiers and merchants by 1726 had diversified into buying, finishing, and exporting cloth. By that time, he had bought this property, which was purchased on the 16th of February, 1726. Here I am with my briefcase standing in front of it, along with Brian Oates, who helped me considerably with the lecture this evening. Come back to that later. Like other cloth merchants, Joseph would purchase his cloth from the clothiers in the market located just outside his home. And again, we've got Peter's wonderful view of what this would have looked like. And you can see by the red arrow there exactly where the Queen's Court was located. He would then purchase his cloth, take it to the workshops down the yard, employ the services of a skilled group of men who would finish it and pack it ready for transportation. It was then stored in his warehouse before being exported via the port of Leeds to his customers, of which an increasing number was located in Sweden. We have a great description of this market. By 1724, Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, witnessed this process, and he wrote, "The increase of the manufacturers of the trade soon made the market too great to be confined to the bridge. It is now kept to the high street, beginning from the bridge and running up north, almost to Market House. It is the cloth market which is indeed a prodigy of its kind, and is not to be equalled in the world." And it's those world links that we'll be examining in some detail shortly. Fortunately, Joseph's account book for the period 1702 to 1728 survives at West Yorkshire Archives and shows that in addition to the Leeds business, he had another shop in Dewsbury. This account book charts the remarkable tenfold increase in trade from £547 13 shillings and fourpence in 1702 to £5,658 and tenpence in 1728. Now, those figures are pretty meaningless to us today if we don't have some idea as to what they were worth. Now, we're lucky because in 1759, Joseph Massey reckoned that a superior clergyman or a lawyer of the time had an income of £100 a year. So, clergyman or a lawyer, £100, he's dealing in £5,658 worth of cloth. An aristocrat like Lord Irwin of Temple Newsham, £10,000 per annum. And yet an ordinary workman in Leeds was lucky to earn 60 pence, 12 shillings, and a woman 3 shillings. As we have noted, his business had benefited from an injection of cash from his mother-in-law, and yet he was very skillful at reducing his debt to her from £1,400 in 1711 to £25 by 1717. By 1724, this rich man who'd accumulated £4,500 worth of money had invested in land all around. His property portfolio, in addition to his house in Leeds, land in Chickenley, owned Dixon land, Thirdly House in Dewsbury, and a large estate in Armley, all of which came to about £3,500. Now, he was a nonconformist and worshipped here at Mill Hill Chapel, but his beliefs ensured that he was excluded from being a member of Leeds Corporation, which was dominated by a Tory Anglican elite. He was not alone in being excluded, and powerful families like the Ibbotsons and the Fentons, his relatives and allies, were also excluded. And yet the Oates family played a critical role in this chapel from his arrival in 1700 to their departure in 1901. And these two pillars here, when the chapel was demolished, were taken to Meanwood side and are still there in Meanwood Park. So he's excluded from being a member of the corporation, but not from getting his hands dirty. In 1714, they allowed him to fulfill the thankless task of being overseer of the poor for the upper division, comprised Upper Brigate and the Hedrow. He perhaps pursued this in an effort to curry favour with the ruling elite. Now, Joseph died on the 27th of November 1729, a very rich man, and he was buried in St. John's. His wife Mary lived on for another 35 years, supported by the children, and died at the age of 86, a remarkable age, truly remarkable age, and like her husband, is buried at St. John's. Now, they left 4 sons, Thomas, George, Josiah, and Samuel, all of whom followed their father into the cloth merchanting business. So let's start with Thomas here. Thomas Oates, their eldest son, had premises at Mill Hill, and with his success, like fellow members of the merchant community, he bought more land. He accumulated in property in Leeds, Woodhouse, and York. One of the features of the various generations of the Oates family was their ability to marry well. Thomas was no different. Through his marriage to Sarah Watson on the 13th of October 1741, he acquired extensive property near Kingston upon Hull at Swanland and West Ella. 2 years later, joy in the family when she gave birth to Elizabeth, an only child, but she died shortly afterwards, aged only 32, and was buried in Mill Hill Chapel. Now, we're going to turn in a minute to examine the other 3 brothers, but all 4 had benefited from being ruled over by the Hanoverian dynasty. They were keen for that to continue. It had brought great stability in which the trade had blossomed. So when there was the Jacobite Rising of 1715, they were keen to demonstrate their loyalty and be seen to make a positive contribution to the defence of the realm. Here they are included in a list of voluntary subscribers for the security of His Majesty's person and government and for the defence of the county of York. George Oates gave 10 guineas, Thomas 10 guineas, and the 2 youngest brothers, Josiah and Samuel, 10 guineas jointly. They moved almost like a pack. They worshipped at Mill Hill just as their brothers had, and were actively linked socially, sharing similar interests, including reading. The Leeds Library is the country's oldest subscription library of its type, still in existence. Although the idea of establishing a circulating library in Leeds had been around for at least a decade, it wasn't until this advertisement appeared in the Leeds Intelligencer on the 9th of August 1768, inviting those interested in encouraging such a venture to meet at Mr. Myers in Brigate, there was clearly a great deal of support. Another meeting was called for the 5th of September, and what we're lucky to have is this page from the Leeds Library Minute Book for 1768. And here I've highlighted Samuel Oates, George Oates, and Josiah Oates, all becoming subscribers, as did Thomas, his daughter Elizabeth, and also Joseph. And they were so highly thought of that Samuel and Joseph were elected to the committee. The Leeds Library's first home in 1768 was a modest back room behind the bookshop owned by Mr. Ogley in Kirkgate, marked here with the red arrow. And it remained there until 1781, when it moved into what had once been a mansion of James Ibbotson. As we've seen, the brothers were extremely close, but in 1750, Thomas died. Upon his death, the bulk of his estate passed to his daughter Elizabeth, but his brothers, Josiah and Samuel, took over his premises in Mill Hill. Let's turn our attention to this gentleman, George, 1717 to 1779. I absolutely love this portrait. It shows a supremely confident, shrewd individual with a stare that would certainly make you think twice about crossing him. He took over his father's business premises, Queen's Court on Briggate. An incredibly lucky find was the inventory for the house, dated the 21st of December 1747, which totaled exactly £350. Just remember, a workman's lucky if he earned 60 pence a week. And this inventory lets us peep through the windows of that house and look inside at its contents. Now we're in the dining room, which was where Brian and I were standing on Briggate, just behind us. And there you've got a glass with sconces, the lighting, for £3, mirror, £4. Then we've got some paintings, and I put in a red arrow there which said 3 family pieces of painting. And I'm wondering if those are the portraits I've managed to show you of Thomas, George, and Samuel. There's a japanned tea table. There's a tea table with screw frame, an easy chair. But look at the yellow arrow, 8 chairs covered with silk. You get some idea of their social activities because there's a card table next, a range of materials, a copper tea kettle and lamp, a rug, a set of burnt china, viz. 12 cups and saucers, all complete, and fine curtains at the window. If he wanted to show off, which he clearly did, if you'd walked into his hall, there was an exceptional set of a dozen silver knives and forks worth £35, a dozen spoons worth £10, a silver waiter, £8, a coffee pot, £11, a set of casters and stand, £16, a fine tankard valued at 11 guineas, and another at 5 guineas. If you'd gone up to his best lodging rooms, had you been going into a Leeds house a generation earlier, this room would have been crammed with Leeds-made furniture from English oak. This isn't. In addition to the fine linen and curtains, you've got furniture made from mahogany coming from Jamaica. You've 6 mahogany chairs and stools, a chest of drawers from mahogany, a mahogany dressing table, a mirror with a mahogany frame, and a mahogany washstand. Absolutely beautiful furniture in a stunning house on the main street of Leeds. And then if he wanted to go out, well, he got his gold watch and chain at £21, a diamond ring to put on, or he could choose from his 7 gold rings that he also had there on his dress. Another remarkable find was George's account book for the period 1749 to 56. R.J. Wilson's masterpiece, Gentlemen Merchants of Leeds, gives a superb account of the activities of cloth merchants in the town from 1700 to 1830. So one anticipates that George simply followed the pattern of his father, purchase of cloth from the clothiers in Briggate, take it down to the alley of Queen's Court where the workshop's there, the skilled craftsman finished it to a high standard and then exported it. And that was not the case. Here is that account book, and I put it in tabular form. He was still very heavily involved in the supply of dye suds. Its cellar was full of chemicals that were critically important to make the correct colour for their discerning customers. Now, I don't intend to go through this in detail, except to point out that you've got all those raw materials down the left-hand side there. You've got some of those which are wood-based, which he was having crushed at his mill in Dewsbury. But look what he's got in his cellar. There are only 2 items that are being produced in England. Woad, which made a blue colour from Lincolnshire, and Orkill, which were from England. Look at the rest. They come from North America, Africa, Baltic and the India, the Mediterranean, Central and South America, the West Indies, and the Balkans. This is a truly international trade. And imagine the organization that was required to get all those substances back from all those disparate parts of the world through Hull, upriver, Port of Leeds, and then brought to his ideally located workshops and cellars in Briggate. Incredible, absolutely incredible. In addition, he had all the different mordants which were used to create different colours from the same raw material. And so we had as well 100 gallons of rape, seville, and green oil in there. So if this is what he's dealing with, the dye substances, where's his cloth? Well, again, these are wonderful account books because they break down exactly what he was trading in that yard. And it isn't what you think. You can see mid-slide that he was dealing in the broadcloth, which was outside his door, and also bays, all worsted mix, and the shalloons. But a huge amount of his trade was in linen and flax, and all types of linen, from coarse linen like buckram, which was used for linings of coats and gowns, to the finest linen, lawn, used by the wealthy for collars and cuffs. You also had huge quantities of Russian linen, cheaper sort, often used in soft furnishings for bed sheets and aprons, and that was coming from Russia, whereas other linen products were coming from Holland and France. And he'd even dabbled in silk, the most expensive material, making gowns, coats, jackets, and purse, with the thread coming from China. He also had huge quantities of flax, the raw material, the flowering plant from which linen is made. The paternoster flax coming from England. But he had flax from Russia, Podolia, today part of Ukraine, and also from Latvia as well. Now, this man was doing exceptionally well. He'd got a thriving export trading cloth, especially to Portugal and Spain. He'd got his business based in Leeds and Dewsbury, and a crushing mill at Dewsbury. He'd got a dyeing business and the provision of dye stuffs for clothiers, and shortly we'll see he was also trading in wine. By 1749, his profit was £3,511, 17 shillings and fourpence. By 1753, it had grown to just over £9,000. Now, if you think Lord Irwin at Temple Newsham House has only got 10,000, how brilliantly was George doing? Now, he wrote this. This year of 1754 is worthy of remark, and is the very first year of my trading life wherein I reckon I have not lost upwards of £100. He appends his initials G.O. there proudly. Now, no one likes a braggart, and boy must he have regretted writing that in his account book. Next year, 1755, was the great Lisbon earthquake, which had struck Portugal and Spain. He immediately lost £723 worth of cloth, which was burnt to a cinder in one of the warehouses. He feared further losses of £600 in Lisbon and a further loss of £290 at Cadiz. Also, he had cloth at Petersburg, which is lost. But fortunately, some of the cloth in Norway, he was secured by insurance. It was a disaster. He estimated his losses were in the region of £3,230. But I think whatever we know about George is, he certainly wasn't, shall we say, a modest man. And he noted, such a blow would have ruined many, but due to my prudent stewardship of the business, it allows me to weather the storm. And next year he bounces back to profit. I think the important thing is that this illustrates the huge risks of being a cloth merchant in 18th century, Leeds. Now, some people, most merchants, they wanted cash immediately for their cloth, but that didn't happen very often. They often had to wait a long time, sometimes years, for payment. And they didn't want the hassle of having to sell goods that they could have exchanged immediately at the port as they dropped the cloth off. But George wasn't daunted by this. At the continental ports, he used the services of specialist factors who exchanged his cloth for wine, which ensured that he had no problem with cash flow and debt. It reduced it. He expanded his wine business and regularly placed advertisements like this in the Leeds papers. And it just showed you how much he was charging. Old port could be purchased for 6 shillings a gallon. My idea of heaven, if only that were the case. And as you can see, what else he had as a member of the discerning public. By this stage, however, he'd made so much money, he didn't want to live in town, and he moved out into Potter Newton to enjoy the fresh air there. Naturally, he was playing a pivotal role in the town, and in October 1774, he wished to subscribe to a new White Cloth Hall, as the second White Cloth Hall of 1755 was now too small and dated. In November, he was appointed to the committee in charge of the project. And those of you who know Leeds know that this gatehouse, this section here, still survives, as does the assembly rooms to the side of it. Now we're going to look at exactly where these brothers moved to. They got money, so they didn't have to stay in the increasingly populated, noisy, filthy and dangerous town centre. And in a minute, we'll see where George, Josiah, Joseph and Edward, these four, where they went to live. This shows you a map of Potter Newton and Chapel Allerton. And the first thing that strikes you is that it has a paucity of population. It's an area of agriculture. The air is fresh. Where the purple arrow is in Potter Newton, George went to live, of which more in a minute. The red arrow is Josiah. The green arrow is Joseph. Carmanor, we know it as today, the judge's lodging. And the orange arrow, where Edward was later to live, which was Meanwood side, and we know that as Meanwood Park. And so, for the book that Rachel Unsworth and I are currently working on Chapel Allerton, you can see that this family had a huge impact on this area. This shows Josiah to the right, the third son of Joseph Oates, who was in business with his younger brother Samuel in Mill Hill and later Ball Lane. With his wife, he too had married well. This is Mary, daughter of John Roebuck of Sheffield, who had come from wealthy merchant stock. This stunning pair of miniatures shows the wealthy couple in their finery. He could afford to buy, in 1755, Allerton Hall as his main residence, but not only buy the old hall, but knock it down and replace it with a fashionable new house in the Palladian style. And he was one of the first merchant families to see the attractions of this northern out township, away from the noise, stench and bustle of those central streets. Here we have to the right the building which still survives today. And if you look across where the red arrow goes, this is the earliest plan I can find of the house. It's a plan of the estate of Freeman Flowers of 1794. You can see it was an elegant box described as, with its stables at the side, the terraced gardens, the wonderful formal gardens leading up to the yellow arrow, which was a viewing hill, a viewing platform, at which guests at Josiah's house could go and stand and admire the gardens and all the landscape around it. They could then come back down and look at the fish pond with its carp in, or walk up to the farmhouse here where there were white turkeys. The Oates family were, like many of their class, involved in agricultural improvement. And this is what it must have looked like. This shows you the formal gardens at Seaton Delaval Hall, but you can see here the terrace overlooking the formal gardens. And here at Wadham College, one of these viewing hills, these viewing platforms. How wealthy are these people, just living that millionaire's lifestyle with their fine coaches and their carriages? We're so lucky because in 1767, the Reverend Joseph Ismay visits Chapel Allerton and he keeps a diary. And he writes, Chapel Allerton is 2 miles north of Leeds and pleasantly situated on the skirt of a fine green waste or moor. There are a long range of good neat buildings on each side of the common, with a spacious plain carpet ground between each row. Mr. Oates's house, now notice that is plural, he's referring to Josiah and George's houses, particularly that on the north side, Josiah's, is an elegant box with neat gardens, pleasant walks, enclosed with palisades to a small farmhouse where poultry are kept. We saw white turkeys at this place, which seems are much in fashion at present. And that was because when you plucked a bronze turkey, it left black marks in the flesh, whereas the white turkey evidently didn't. Well, that was the sales spiel. Gentlemen and ladies from Leeds frequently make an excursion on horseback or in their carriages to Chapeltown in order to enjoy the fresh air upon the moor in the mornings, that they may eat their dinners with a keener appetite and a better relish at their return. This village may, I think, be called the Montpellier of Yorkshire. Everything seemed to be going so well for Josiah. Moved into this fine new house, but on the 1st of October, 1755, shortly after moving in, disaster struck. His only child, Sarah, died aged 1. Without an heir, he turned to his brother, Samuel, here featured. The two had always been close, and in an act of incredible generosity, he left his entire estate in trust to his brother's son, Samuel Hamer Oates, who was only 3 at the time. When Josiah died in 1782, the estate passed to his nephew, who immediately advertised the accommodation to let. And this is an incredible advert. It tells you exactly what the house consists of. This commodious dwelling house consists of, on the ground floor, a drawing room, a dining room, a parlour, a kitchen, servants' hall, notice plural, a butler's pantry, a storeroom, and then you go up 1 pair of stairs to a drawing room, 6 lodging rooms with rooms in the attics for the servants, 2 back kitchens with 2 chambers, a coach house and stable for 5 horses. Good cellars to the house, and the whole of the premises are well watered, with a garden well stocked with fruit trees, a fish pond with carp, and the ground about the house laid out in taste with shrubs, gravel walks, and together with such quantity of land as may be wanted. Now, there'd been, understandably, break-ins in the area, and it's interesting to note that not only do they say the premises are in good repair, but also it's got locks and bolts and all necessary fixtures for the immediate reception of a gentleman and lady. And I love this NB. To those who are not acquainted with the situation of Chapeltown, it may be necessary to say that it is situate within 2 miles of Leeds in a genteel neighbourhood and esteemed the pleasantest village in that part of the country. It is also fine sporting country, and fox and harehounds are kept in the neighbourhood. Now, that year of 1782, we're so lucky because a Leeds merchant decided to log down how much he thought had been sold in Leeds Cloth Market and who had sold the most. That year, just over £1 million worth of cloth went through the cloth halls. And when you look at the top 10 merchants, at the head is Denison, £50,000. And then those who are familiar with the history of Leeds, the names just flow: Bischoff, Dixon, Leeds, Wormold, Woolwich, Stansfield, Armitage, Lloyds. But when we get to number 8, Samuel, and number 10, George, if you combine the amount that they were exporting or selling in the country, it comes to 60,000. The Oates family was selling more than any other merchant in Leeds. Now let's return to George. In 1757, he estimated his worth at £15,328. 2 years later, it had risen to £20,000. So what does he do with all his spare money? Well, he buys the Carr House estate for £1,500 in 1765, which comprised 46 acres and a large house. By 1771, the time of this fantastic survey, he had 3 farms and 86 acres and had the cartographer draw this wonderful plan, because he now had Tunnehall Hill Farm, Woodside Farm, and the Carr House estate. He'd initially moved from Briggate. We don't have a date for that yet. And he first moved into Potter Newton Lodge. He lived there extremely happily and decided to purchase the whole property. But in 1770, he took out a 5-year lease on Low Hall here at Potter Newton. He and his wife, Sarah, loved this place with its formal gardens, its carp pond, its stable block, its brew house. It was beautiful. And he rented it initially for £84 a year. Again, think the lawyers getting £100 a year. He wanted to improve it, and so he was given an allowance of £112 for these improvements. And when they were finished 2 years later, the rent went up to £140, and he kept the lease for the next 23 years. What's tragic for the Oates family is often when things seem to be going well financially, on the family front, they're a disaster. Sarah bore him 5 children: Benjamin, Mary, Anne, Sarah, and Sally, every one of them dying in infancy. Can you imagine how dreadful that must have been? Fortunately, George, here top left, had 3 sons that lived to adulthood. We have Joseph, George, and Frederick, and 2 daughters survived, Sophia and Louisa. Sarah, George's wife, however, died on the 31st of December 1768, only 45 years of age. Terrible. Now, this was a deeply religious family, as we've seen, and they worshipped at Mill Hill. So it shouldn't be surprising then that Louisa went on to marry the Reverend William Wood, the presiding minister there. And we need to remember that name, Wood, because with him came a link to significant amounts of capital that are later going to be invested. Sophia, George's other daughter, married Thomas Robinson of Manchester, continuing the family's link to members of the wealthy Unitarian merchant class were prospering in the increasingly successful Lancashire cloth town. Excellent marriages were arranged for all the boys. Joseph, here on the left, the eldest, married Elizabeth, daughter and co-heir of Joshua Rayner, a successful merchant. George William married Mary, daughter of Robert Hibbert of Manchester, and Frederick married Phoebe, 3rd daughter and co-heir of William Reed. The Oates family greatly increased their wealth by these marriages and took full advantage of the networks associated with the marriages to advance their fortunes. Every one of them followed in their father's footsteps into the cloth trade. Now, we shall shortly look at Joseph in detail, but let's first say something briefly about George William and then Frederick. George William had his premises based in Briggate and, like his father, traded in wine. By 1791, he was living in a fine house in a fashionable area of Leeds known as Little Woodhouse. His house was built upon a delightful eminence and commands a most extensive and beautiful prospect, which cannot be interrupted by any buildings or plantations. Later, he moved to Park Place, where he lived until his death in 1797. Frederick, he also bought a 5-acre plot in Little Woodhouse, and in 1786 paid for the construction of a delightful villa, which he later named Belmont House. The front rooms had spectacular views across the Aire Valley and to the Park Estate. His house was insured for £700, a further £400 on contents, plus £50 for silver and £100 for the stable and laundry. But let's turn our attention to Joseph, who, due to the serendipitous nature of the survival of archival material, we know much more about. When George Oates died on the 20th of December 1779, after but a few days of illness, Joseph inherited the lease on Low Hall, where his father and mother had lived. But when this expired in 1809, he took out a long lease on Weekwood Hall, a fine property in North Leeds, and where he lived in some style. Of course, today it's now a hotel. He also inherited the Carhouse estate. He demolished the 17th century property of the Marshall family, which you can see here to the left, built this fashionable house in a modern style, and a stable block of 1796, which still survives today. If you go to the gates of the judging lodging and peer through, you can actually just see the edge of that fantastic stable block. He also constructed this, the Revolution Well, at the head of a small spring abutting Stonegate Road. Excluded from politics because of his nonconformist beliefs, it didn't exclude him from having strong views. We've seen that the family loathed the Jacobites and were delighted when William and Mary actually invaded. And he inscribed on the back of this, "Bog in the adjoining field drained, spring opened and conducted hither for the benefit of the passenger and the neighbouring house, for November the 5th, 1788, the 100th anniversary from the landing of King William, in memory of which happy era, this is by Joseph Oates, inscribed the Revolution Well." And that is still there today, even though it was moved in 1930. Now, as we've already noted, Joseph had married well to Elizabeth, daughter and co-heir of Joshua Rayner, and they had 5 children: Mary, Sarah, George, Joseph Henry, and Edward. But Joseph could see that as the French and Napoleonic Wars dragged on, the old ways of doing business were numbered. He must have watched in horror as a number of his contemporaries, like Hudson and Ellen, who had stuck slavishly to the old methods of being a merchant, went bankrupt. Like all merchants in the town, they had been dependent on the skills of croppers to finish and dress the cloth to the highest standards. In essence, there were 2 operations. First, the raising of the nap using teasels, and then cropping the cloth by use of shears, which you can see happening to the left of the screen here. These shears were 5 feet in length. The steel blades alone were around 2 feet long and were joined by a spring bow handle. Now, these craftsmen were expensive to employ and were well organized. It became obvious to Joseph that more money could be made if these costs could be significantly reduced. Now, there had already been the invention of the gig mill, which you see to the right here, and the shearing frame, which simplified the process and enabled cheaper, less expensive labour to be employed. But the cloth dressers of Leeds had successfully opposed the introduction of this machinery. In 1799, a riot had taken place at Cross Flats, Beeston, where the gig mill owned by Messrs. Johnson of Holbeck had been burnt to the ground. The mob had been extremely well organised and had ensured that no light could be brought near the scene, so that it made the identification of the culprits impossible. After this willful act of arson, few had had the courage to introduce this type of machinery in Leeds. Moreover, this occurred at a time when the government feared that the working classes of England would cooperate with the French if they invaded the country, and so it created real alarm amongst the middle classes of the town. In 1802, the mayor of Leeds did his best to discourage merchant manufacturers from adding big mills or shearing frames to their work, being convinced that horrid outrages would occur. But the Oates family had always been risk takers. Despite such warning, Joseph decided to start the firm of Oates, Smithson and Wood and build a new mill which would include the much hated gig mills and shearing frames. In 1811, Joseph and his partners built Oakland Mill just off what today is Meanwood Road. Those of you who know the area, it's near the Kingfisher factory. So they built Oakland's Mill with additional capital that came from J.S. Smithson, Joseph's brother-in-law, and George William Wood of Manchester, his son-in-law and nephew. They were clearly tempted by a real increase in their returns, but a considerable fortune was tied up in this mill, and its success was critically important to the family. It is hardly surprising, after all that information, that the following year, 1812, the mill complex was targeted by the Luddites, who were determined to stop the spread of machinery that led to the suppression of wages and the eradication of their jobs. On Sunday, the 19th of January, the building which contained those gig mills and shear frames was badly damaged by fire, which had been started at 7 o'clock by the rioters who had placed combustible materials in the attics. Fortunately, some of this did not take alight. Troops, the Scots Greys, were immediately dispatched, and when they arrived at the scene, it's reported that they faced thousands who had thronged to the spot. Many lamented the calamity, but the multitude were shouting and proclaiming it a blessing. Although the blaze was eventually brought under control, the conflagration had badly damaged the upper story of the mill and also a great deal of stock. Fortunately, the losses were calculated at £500 only, and this was covered by an insurance policy with the Norwich Union. On the 21st of January 1812, the partners placed this notice in the local paper. They acknowledged and returned their grateful thanks to the mayor and other magistrates of Leeds, to Captain Kerr and the officers, non-commissioned officers and privates of the 2nd Dragoon, and to their numerous private friends for the zeal and activity with which they assisted in extinguishing the alarming fire. But I find this truly remarkable. Prince Regent was made aware of the fire at Oakland's Mill, and he was asked if he would be willing to grant a royal pardon for anyone willing to incriminate their companions who had taken part in this action. Prince Regent immediately granted the pardon, but said that the reward of 100 guineas was not enough. Very shortly, It went up to £500 by the 29th of February, and by the 30th of March, £1,000 for information leading to the arrest of anyone involved. Now, if you bear in mind that if you were lucky as a workman in 1812 to earn £1, they're offering £1,000 reward. No one, not a single person, gave evidence leading to these people being arrested. Now, the period from early 1790s to 1815 had proved extremely turbulent for the economy due to the costly war with France. The halcyon days of the merchant class were over, and a brave new world emerged. Now, when you look at Joseph, he looks a kindly, caring man. And when he died in 1824, he really should have been immensely proud of his efforts in trying to secure a prosperous future for his children. Unfortunately, he left a complex will, which depended on them all working collaboratively. It proved a nightmare. George, the eldest son, arrogant, belligerent, and lazy, moved from Carr House to Weetwood Hall and left the difficulties of making the will work to his younger brother, Joseph Henry, who had moved here to Oatlands House near the mill complex. Poor Joseph Henry not only had to supervise the day-to-day running of the cloth business, but also had to try and sort out the will. There was constant friction with his oldest brother. Joseph Henry sent a constant stream of letters to Edward, the youngest brother, a lawyer who was based in London and who actually went to Glyn's bank on a monthly basis to collect the money from the profits of the mill. Well, he kept getting letters from Joseph Henry complaining, and these still survive in West Yorkshire Archive and make for fascinating reading. On the 1st of February 1825, Joseph Henry wrote to Edward, "The fact is simply this, and true as it is simple. We owe Beckett's Bank so much money that without putting a bill of some description into their hands, I dare not ask a renewal of credit at Glyn's Bank in London. I assure you, I have not had it in my power to pay a clothier 1 penny during the last month. But the very first remittance I receive, I shall go straight to Beckett's, accompanied by a request to renew your credit at Glyn's for £400. The family was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Would they survive? Log in to next year's lecture to see what happened to this remarkable family." Now, before I take questions, I just want to acknowledge the wonderful help I've had. This lecture wouldn't have been possible without the support of Brian Oates. He was a magnificent host when I went to stay with him in London, and he so generously shared his knowledge of the family and the contents of his remarkable archive. So thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. John Cruikshank, I know you're out there. You provided a superb insight into the mysteries of 18th century cloth production, the complexities of the pedigrees of Leeds families, particularly the wretched Fenton clan, and also your understanding of the unfathomable language of old deeds. Thank goodness you were there. Christine Holstock for information on dyes and mordants. Again, something, a mystery to me. And a Goodridge for your help at the Leeds Library. Mickey Grinrod and his staff at West Yorkshire for bringing me all those boxes of Oates materials. Rachel Unsworth for her support, and Anthony Ram for putting together the programme. And last but not by no means least, officers of the authority, of the Thorsby Society, Chris, and then Sue Alexander and Alan Slomson. The IT works. Thank you so much. So now I think it's question time.
Thank you, Steve, for that. That was a fascinating talk with a tremendous level of detail. I'd just like to ask about the portraits. It's just amazing to have such a a great collection of family portraits going back such a long time. Where did they come from? Are they still in the family?
How lucky am I? Some of them are in the Oates Museum, and the others are the family portraits of Brian Oates, who, so kindly let me photograph everything and anything. And when you see next year's lecture, again, the richness of the portraiture and the family photograph albums. I mean, you find everything from the lake at Meanwood Park. I never knew there was a lake in Meanwood Park. And now we've got pictures of them boating on it. There's Adel Church there with the family photograph. It's such a rich vein. It really is. It's incredible. And again, as I say, so generous of everyone to share everything with me.
Just looking at the, there's one or two questions coming in on the chat. Somebody's asked about the brothers' coat of arms, suggesting that a quarter looks like the Fenton coat of arms.
The Fentons, as you gathered from my kind of acknowledgement of John Cruikshank, what a nightmare. I mean, the difficulty with all these families is they have favourite names, and that really is problematic. I mean, why I find that early coat of arms interesting is that Edward, who we'll learn more about, the lawyer, next time, he is quite clearly obsessive compulsive. And he wants a new coat of arms. And he submits to the College of Arms details of all the separate families I named, like the Rayners, etc., that the Woods they married in. He went to enormous length, and in West Yorkshire Archive, there are literally boxes of these pedigrees, and Brian has similar pedigree after pedigree after pedigree, all finely written in Edward's handwriting. So yes, I'm sure that's right. It's the Fentons. But there's a new coat of arms which I'll be talking about in some detail next time, because Edward was very keen that it appeared in T.D. Whitaker's 1816 volume of Lloydis in Elmick, which he only just caught the last end of the production. So in some volumes, the Oates coat of arms appears in the pedigree. In others, it's excluded. So and the correspondence still exists. How wonderful.
Yeah. Very good. So somebody's asking where the Oates Museum is.
It's Gilbert White Museum down south of England. Selborne. If you look up Selborne, you'll see where it is there, and that's got some of the Frank Oates material, the great explorer. Again, more of which next time. So it's Selborne.
Yeah. Okay. Another question: is there a link with the Oates brothers, saddlers in Lower Hedgerow?
Not that I'm aware of. No. And I think the thing to say is that the Oates families actually feature in the parish registers of Leeds for a much earlier period, which is why I tried to draw that distinction between all the members of the Oates family who come from Joseph coming from Chickenley. Because, yes, there were other, obviously, early branches. I mean, the Chickenley branch of the family come originally from the Dodworth area near Barnsley. But when Edward is putting forward the case to the College of Arms, he claims that the Oates family go right the way back to William the Conqueror coming across and fighting at the Battle of Hastings and the Fitz Oates. So numerous, I think, is the word. There are numerous Oates.
Yes. Okay. Well, I can't see any more questions coming through. Nobody. I mean, if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, you'd be very welcome. But I think somebody. There's one come through. Somebody's asking, is there any information regarding how many people were employed and how much were they paid?
At Oatland Mill? And the answer is no. And if that refers to the earlier documentation, then again, there's no information as to about how many people the family were employing. It's interesting what has survived and what hasn't survived. I mean, we have Violet Oates to thank for the materials that were brought to Leeds in 1941 and afterwards. How lucky were we that she contacted Leeds Council and deposited them now they're kept at the West Yorkshire Archive, Leeds at Gilderson. But they are selected. Obviously, they've been sorted through. When I looked at those, the reason I put an appeal out, which Brian very kindly answered, was that it was clear that there were missing archives. So you'd have a run of pedigrees and then a load missing. You'd have a run of documents and then another load missing. So I was very lucky. I was very lucky to fill that gap. But no, there isn't any information. And there's a surprising paucity of information on Oatlands Mill. They really tried to keep that under the radar. So there's no great opening advertised of this new gig mill. Quite understandably, they didn't want people to know that machinery was in there at all. But I find it very significant that apart from the occasional attack afterwards, once that £1,000 reward went out, all began to become silent. So no.
Yeah.
I have a question. Kevin Grady speaking. Can you hear me, Stephen?
Yes, I can, Kevin. Yes.
Yes. Now, I was just about, as the lecture was going on, I was just about to think this is a bit like a Beresford lecture. In fact, it was certainly as good as a Beresford lecture and just as fascinating. And I remember
thank you for that confidence.
Somebody once said that Maurice Beresford made an hour and a quarter seem like an hour and 10 minutes. And I thought, this Stephen is going to, he's not going to finish this in another 20 minutes. But of course, then you stopped so abruptly. And of course, one of the reasons there's a paucity of questions is because we all want to know what's happened next. And you've told us we can't ask you till a year's time. But I did wonder, I mean, of course, obviously, R.G. Wilson wrote his wonderful book, The Gentleman Merchants of Leeds. And from what you're saying, that really that you're suggesting from the knowledge of the Oates family that our understanding of gentlemen merchants as R.G. Wilson had it isn't quite right.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's what is so surprising about those account books. I mean, John Cruikshank said to me, there's a PhD thesis in those documents, and he's absolutely right. I've scratched the surface, and I don't have the in-depth knowledge of the cloth industry at the time. But I think and I don't want to knock R.G. Wilson, I think it's a magnificent book. But there is no doubt, Kevin, you were right. It's a gross oversimplification of what was going on. And I think that it's the variety of cloth, not just woolen and worsted cloth, that's being dealt in. And, you know, the amount of Russian linen he's bringing in is staggering. It's staggering. So, yes, I think it needs to be re-examined. And it would be great if other families had within their archival material similar wonderful account books that the Oates family have given to us.
Yeah, I mean, just to say additionally to that, I mean, in the process of researching this, clearly you've unearthed, as you brilliantly always do, all sorts of sources that we don't know about, and I think, I mean, some of those sources are as yet uncatalogued records at the West Yorkshire Archive Service and in other places.
The thing is with it, Kevin, it is vast, and you're right. And all the time, new material is coming to light. And that's why we both agree the Thoresby Society is just such a wonderful organisation, because our network of friends never stop looking for new sources of information.
Steve, may I chip in?
Yes, you can, providing it isn't a technical question, John.
Well, it's more like an expansion or comment of something you've just said. R.G. Wilson's book is magnificent, but it is, in fact, just an introductory essay. And just about every part of his book could, and at some stage should, be expanded, because the story is bigger and more complicated than you would ever believe from his nice, simple little pamphlet. And yes, the records you've dug out, and as Kevin said, there's more yet to be dug. I think the society and its members have got stuff to keep them occupied for a while yet.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you both.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Yeah. Okay. There's lots of compliments coming in, Steve. Lots of people looking forward to the sequel. But it looks like that's an end to the questions.
Right.
So I think it just remains for me to thank you very much again and remind people of the date of the next lecture, which is on the 18th of January by Janet Douglas on the Friend of Poor Children, Dr. William Hall. So on that basis, just like to wish everybody a very happy Christmas, and I think we can sign off if there's nothing else anyone wants to add.
Thank you very much all for listening.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, very much indeed.